Today is Monday, May 19th, 2025. This is Quick Start from CBN News. I'm Dan Andros. Joe Biden announces a major health update. We'll have that top story and more on today's podcast, where we bring you news from a Christian perspective. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a rating. If you haven't done that already, we'd greatly appreciate that. Big help for people finding this podcast and stumbling upon it. If you give us that rating on there. You can email us as well, right to our inbox. Our email address is quickstartpodcast@cbn.org. Joining me today on this Monday edition of the Quick Start Podcast to get through the news of the cray, as we call it here, CBN's Billy Hallowell. And on the focus story, Billy, a massive explosion has rocked California.
Yeah, this is a pretty shocking story over the weekend surrounding a reproductive fertility clinic, and we'll get into that. It's being investigated as an act of terror.
All right, details on that coming up here in just a minute. On the main thing, temporary protected status for Afghans in the United States is set to expire this week. Madison Seals has more and the implications of that coming up on the main thing. All right, make sure you subscribe to all of our CBN News podcasts, including Billy's Newsmakers podcasts, full-length interviews each and every weekday. Make sure you're checking that out. Also, CBN's Abigail Robertson and her podcast, Heaven Meets Earth. New episodes drop on Mondays, so you got a new one in there today. Go ahead and check that out. Links are in the description of this podcast episode. And with that, we are going to head to the news in 90 seconds. And former President Joe Biden has been diagnosed with aggressive prostate cancer that has already spread to his bones, according to a statement from his office yesterday. Doctors found the cancer during a recent physical and say it's hormone sensitive, which means treatment options are available. The 82-year-old's condition has sparked renewed scrutiny over past efforts to downplay his health and cognitive decline, including revelations from a new book and leaked audio of his interview with special counsel Robert Hur. President Trump and former Vice President Kamala Harris both issued public messages of support, wishing Biden a full recovery. And we're learning more about the tragic ship crash at the Brooklyn Bridge that killed two young Mexican Navy cadets over the weekend. The tall ship Cuauhtémoc lost steering just before 8:30 p.m. Saturday and slammed into the bridge while sailing up the East River during a goodwill tour. A total of 277 crew were on board, most of them cadets. Killed were 20-year-old America Sanchez, a champion swimmer, and Nadal Marcos, both reportedly on the ship's mast during the time of the collision. Those are just some of today's top headlines. You can check out more stories over at cbnnews.com. And obviously the big news, Billy, probably former President Joe Biden's diagnosis. And obviously, first and foremost, just praying for his health there. Cancer. Everybody knows somebody impacted by this horrible disease, so wishing him a full recovery there. But you do have all these questions now coming out about what do people know. We got Jake Tapper's book talking about the cover-up, essentially, by Democrats and maybe by some in the media, just kind of not willing to really look into his health and whether or not this is connected. That conversation has been sparked up once again.
Yeah, I mean, it's heartbreaking and sad whenever anybody is going through, something like this. And so we've got to be praying for him. But it does open up those questions. And I think because there were so many concerns for so long during the entirety of the presidency, yeah, right? To then sort of have this situation happened. So, I mean, look, Trump's only been in a couple of months, right? So Biden was president not that long ago. And for it to have spread this much, there are going to be questions of how long and why this wasn't caught earlier and all those sorts of things. But beyond that, we need to be praying for him. Really just very sad news.
Yeah. And there's clips going around. I mean, people are showing there was a clip of Biden when he was president talking about something and these contaminants and where he was speaking. And he talked about cancer, and he said, and he made the comment, like I and so many others I know have cancer, and people just attributed to a gaffe at that time. And maybe it was, but these questions are going to keep swirling. And, separate from the cancer diagnosis, which we said, obviously we're praying for the best there, but I do think that people need to be held accountable if they were not fully honest with Biden's health during his term as president. If they were lying about it, knowingly lying to the American public, then people need to be held accountable for that. That is just something that we cannot be doing as a country, and citizens have a right to know the health of their leaders. And so if they were covering that up, I think people really need to be held accountable for that. But we'll keep you posted on what we see on that, and of course on former President Biden's health going forward. All right, we're going to head over to the focus story now. And there was, as we mentioned here just a moment ago, that massive explosion that rocked California over the weekend. Tell me about what happened here.
Yes, this was a bombing at a reproductive and fertility center in Palm Springs, California. It happened around 11 a.m. local time on Saturday, and this was at the American Reproductive Centers. And the individual at the center of this, his name, and this is the suspect, is Guy Edward Bartkus, and he's from 29 Palms, California. But we'll get into that in a little bit here. But really, a really shocking development, this explosion that seems to have been intentionally set in a vehicle in a parking lot right near that fertility center, opening up a lot of questions, a lot of fear in that community, and obviously national headlines because of the strange nature of this situation.
Yeah. What do we know? What do we know about this suspect in this bombing?
Yeah, so he was 25 years old. He is believed to be deceased. They're investigating and looking at the remains. Obviously, the nature of an explosion. If you die in an explosion like that, it can be difficult to identify the remains. And so authorities are investigating that. But as I mentioned, he's from 29 Palms, California. And Palm Springs Police Chief Andrew Mills described this individual as having the intent on harming others. And this is being called an act of terrorism. It's being labeled an act of terrorism by authorities. And this is what we saw. There are a couple of quotes out there from different authorities, but the FBI Los Angeles field office, that assistant director, Akil Davis, put out a statement saying that the subject, the individual at the center of this, had nihilistic ideation. And he said, and this was a targeted attack against the IVF facility. Make no mistake, we are treating this, as I said yesterday, as an intentional act of terrorism. And then he went on to say, we are fairly confident that Mr. Bartkus is our primary suspect, a person of interest. And so some of the other things that are sort of being floated about Bartkus. Again, that this is all preliminary. They're trying to figure out exactly what happened. But obviously they believe he set this car bomb. He died in that attack. 4 other people were injured, which, by the way, all 4 of those people have reportedly been released from the hospital. So the only, fatality was the person they believe was responsible for this. But he apparently allegedly also tried to live stream the attack, but failed to do so. And so really just troubling. They're going through, I think this is important to mention, they're going through social media activity. And, we live in an era where you can do that, where if somebody has left videos or social media activity, you can kind of go through that and see, what the motivation might be. They're still trying to figure out some of those things. But the New York Post and other outlets, they have reported that Bartkus had fanatical pro-death beliefs and allegedly expressed thoughts opposed to bringing people in the world without their consent. And this was apparently a belief based on trying to prevent future suffering among those people, that people should have the right to essentially decide whether or not they're able to come into this world. And so some really strange purported ideas coming from this individual.
And how is the reproductive center that got hit? How are they responding?
Yeah. Oh, one more thing I'll mention before I answer that too. That there was also a number of pieces of information. One that came from U.S. Attorney for the Central District of California, Bill Esali. He put out a statement on X talking about this manifesto. They said there's apparently an anti-pro-life manifesto believed to be authored by the suspect. And so that's being investigated by the FBI too. So there may be more details that come out in that. I think that's an important thing for us to mention. But so the American Reproductive Center is at the center of all of this. They put out a pretty long statement on Facebook saying that they're calling for hope. They're feeling hope, even though this is such a tragic situation. They said it's unexpected, and they confirmed that the vehicle exploded in the parking lot near their building. They said, quote, "We are heartbroken to learn that this event claimed a life and caused injuries, and our deepest condolences go out to the individuals and families affected. We are immensely grateful to share that no members of the ARC team were harmed, and our lab, including all eggs, embryos, and reproductive materials, remains fully secured and undamaged." And they said that their mission has always been to help build families, and that this event reminds them how fragile and precious life is.
Yeah, very, look, listen, troubling because of the beliefs that this kid had. I call him a kid. I don't know. He just looks young in the pictures, but the beliefs that he had in this sort of, like you said, nihilistic sort of death wish sort of worldview, very, very troubling, but thankful that really nothing much was damaged. I mean, except for him, which is a tragic life lived for sure. And it's interesting, Billy, because I saw over the weekend as this news was breaking, you saw people online before we had the identity of the suspect here, kind of immediately going after and saying this was going to be a radical pro-life extremist, which I always find interesting because generally speaking, the overwhelming majority of pro-lifers generally are the ones trying to preserve life. So you're not going to find them blowing stuff up. And so I found that interesting. It seems like maybe pro-choicers or pro-abortion folks are like excited to get pin that on, you know, some extreme activism on pro-lifers, but that was quickly sort of put out once we saw the ideology and the social media posts, like you mentioned, of this young man.
Yeah, I mean, we got to stop this nonsense. You know, it happens all the time. You know, there's a shooting, and it's like, well, immediately we got to ban guns. It's like, well, we don't even know the details of how this happened, right?
Yeah, jumping to conclusions, 100%.
Yeah. And it's way too common. It's way too common. And in this case, you obviously have a situation that seems to be quite the opposite of that, right? It seems like this is a person who, you know, allegedly, from what we know, didn't value bringing more lives into the world, right? That didn't want to see that happen. So you can get into the ins and the outs of all of these debates, but man, it's just a heartbreaking and insane situation. And this is somebody who was not known apparently to the FBI or authorities. And again, you wonder, how do all these people fall through the cracks again and again and again?
Yeah, it really is troubling. And we certainly need to be praying that hopefully all of us in our own circles, if we see someone who's saying troubled things, perhaps we'll be in position. God will have put us in a scenario where maybe we're the ones that can say something. Who knows? Because you look at people like this and you're thinking, who was in his life that could have spoke truth to him and taken him off of this dark path that he was going around? So I think we need to be praying for that in our lives, because there's so many millions of people out there. All it takes is a couple people to just go off the rails and get down a dark path and nobody sees them. And then we don't find out until headlines are made. And that's always when something really, really bad has happened. But, you know, thankfully it wasn't worse than it could have been in this particular case, but appreciate you bringing that one and breaking it down on the podcast today, Billy. And we're going to head over to the main thing now. And temporary protected status for Afghans in the United States is set to expire this week. And that could mean thousands of Afghanis could be returning to Afghanistan. Chelsea Sobolik with World Relief joined Madison Seals to talk about the current conditions there and what this means for Christians in particular. That conversation is today's main thing.
The Trump administration announced it would be ending the protected status for thousands of Afghans here in the United States. Chelsea, what does that mean for them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Afghans, after the fall of Kabul, entered the U.S. on different statuses. So one population was paroled in by the U.S. government, and then another population enjoyed what's called temporary protected status, which is intended to be a kind of short-term protection for people living in the U.S. who conditions back home are unsafe and they can't safely return. So Afghans, the Department of Homeland Security announced this week that it would be removing TPS, temporary protected status, for Afghans. So what this means is it's winding down, I think it's next month, so pretty quickly. And the situation in Afghanistan is completely unstable for a number of different populations that I think Christians care about, namely Christians, religious minorities, and women and girls. Since the Taliban took over in 2021, those populations, women and girls and religious minorities, do not enjoy protections in Afghanistan under the Taliban.
Yeah, and speaking of those conditions back home, that's what I'd like to ask you about next, because the White House is saying that the conditions have improved enough in Afghanistan for them to go home. But what more do you know about the current conditions in Afghanistan, and would you agree with that?
Another great question. For religious minorities, for Christians especially, Afghanistan's currently under the Taliban rule, and Afghanistan has what's called apostasy laws. So it's illegal actually for someone to convert from being a Muslim to another religion. So for Afghan Christians who have been in the U.S. on TPS or another status, for them to go back home to Afghanistan would almost certainly be a death sentence. For women and girls, kind of leading up to the fall of Kabul, Taliban leaders assured the world that women and girls would enjoy freedom in society, and they have been stripped of almost every freedom. They cannot go to school, they cannot work outside the home, they cannot enjoy a lot of the freedoms that they had for decades while Afghanistan was relatively free. And then the last kind of bucket is the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan right now. It's, I think, 1 in 4 people in Afghanistan are facing acute food insecurity. So I would say that it's still a very dangerous place to live and to be, and especially for people returning home. That I would urge the administration to extend this TPS status for a couple more years to see if conditions on the ground improve.
Yeah, and considering all these conditions, how is World Relief working to help Afghan refugees, even as government funding has been suspended?
Yeah, so we work with private donors and churches as well to welcome Afghans who have arrived. We still are seeing Afghans arriving on what's called a special immigrant visa. So these are Afghans who served alongside our U.S. military. And then we're serving Afghans who are currently here with local churches. The thing I love so much about World Relief is the local church really is the heart of all we do here domestically and around the world. And so we are serving by welcoming, we're serving by getting them connected to their local or to local communities throughout the U.S. and really helping them integrate into society. So, these are friends and neighbors for many of us, and I think we want them to be safe. And right now, we believe that the safest thing for many of our Afghan neighbors and allies and brothers and sisters in Christ is we don't believe it's safe to return home to Afghanistan right now. We hope those conditions improve soon, but right now we don't think it's the safest thing.
And is there anything else that you think is important for people to know or understand about this situation?
Yeah, it's a great question. Immigration is extraordinarily complex. One of the things that World Relief has actually worked on over the past couple weeks in conjunction with a number of faith partners is urging the administration to offer protections for Afghan Christians. So these Afghans cross the U.S.-Mexico border, and most of them are in some process of seeking asylum. As you might know, the asylum process is incredibly long and very backlogged right now. And these individuals, the administration was not targeting Afghan Christians. They sent this notice to anyone who used the CBP One app, but one of the to self-deport, and Afghan Christians got that notice as well. And it's extraordinarily dangerous for an Afghan Christian to return back to Afghanistan. And even if the U.S. doesn't have diplomatic relations to deport someone to Afghanistan, going to a third country, they don't enjoy the same type of legal protections that they would under asylum or under protection here in the U.S. So we're continuing to urge the administration to offer protection for Afghan Christians who, again, would face violence or worse if they returned home to Afghanistan.
And you mentioned so many of them are our neighbors and friends. And are there any specific ways that Christians here in the U.S. can be praying for and helping those Afghan refugees either while they're still here or once they're back in Afghanistan?
I think several things. I think on a fundamental level, Christ calls us to love God and love our neighbor. And right now, many of us have Afghan neighbors in our communities, in our states, and in our country. And so warmly welcoming those who the Lord has brought here, encouraging one another in our faith for those Afghans who share our faith, using this opportunity to tell of the good news. You know, one of the things I love about the United States is we enjoy rich religious freedom. I'm not going to be at risk of losing my life for sharing the good news of the gospel. And so getting to share the good news of the gospel with those. And then very practically, meeting needs. Moving to a new country is extraordinarily difficult. Learning a new language, getting integrated into a community, helping your children enroll in schools, very practical things like that. And then I think the last thing I would say is it's a very human thing to want safety for ourselves. I'm a mom of a little boy, and I would probably walk the ends of the earth to make sure he was safe and protected. And I think it's a very human thing. Again, at World Relief, we want safe and secure borders and orderly immigration process, but I also want to remind people that Afghanistan is one of the worst places in the world to be a Christian, one of the top 10 most dangerous places to be a Christian. They're facing extraordinarily difficult humanitarian situations, and at the end of the day, it's a very human thing to want to feed your children and to want to practice your faith without fear of being thrown in prison or worse.
All right, Madison, appreciate that report right there. And we certainly need to be praying for all the people that are dealing with potentially having to go back to Afghanistan, especially Christians who we know what happens with Christians over there, heavily persecuted. The Taliban is running roughshod after the Biden administration's hasty withdrawal and scattered withdrawal that left things just completely chaotic over there. And the Taliban is once again in control. And that's not good news for a lot of people, in particular Christians. So appreciate that report there, Madison. That's going to leave us with time on the podcast today for one last thing.
We've got Psalm 121, 7-8. The Lord will keep you from all harm. He will watch over your life. The Lord will watch over your coming and going, both now and forevermore. And I think that, it's not a promise that we're never going to have bad things happen,
Right.
but that God is always going to be there for us. And I think that now and forevermore is such a comforting piece of that puzzle.
Absolutely. Amen. Great spot to leave it on as we kick off this week on the Quick Start podcast. As always, get yourself on over to cbnnews.com and faithwire.com for more news from a Christian perspective, Lord willing. And that creek don't rise up on us. We'll be back here tomorrow with more. God bless. We'll see you then. Enjoy the rest of your Monday.